it has a substantial effect on interstate commerce when aggregated across every state. Insofar as we just set the minimum wage, that is not violating the horizontal protection of separation of powers if we set it. If, however, we were to delegate to the Secretary of Labor or the President of the United States or somewhat other executive branch official the power to prescribe rules making sure that the minimum wage was set fairly, that would be an unacceptable delegation of that legislative power over to the executive branch. Now, we haven't done that with the minimum wage. It's still an improper exercise of federal power, in my view. But at least we haven't exercised that there. In other areas, let's take, for example, clean air. Clean air is something over which we have a basis for authority, because if you've got a factory or a mobile source of pollution in one state, it can emit things that can move into another state and cause problems downwind. But we've delegated a lot of what power we do have in the federal government to executive branch agencies. We've got something, for example, called the Clean Air Act. Now, a lot of good has been done through the Clean Air Act. We've significantly abated things like acid rain problems, other air pollutants that have caused a lot of problems for people. The Clean Air Act, this is a slight oversimplification. But as I explained in our lost Constitution, it's a little bit like we said, we shall have clean air. We hereby declare that we shall have clean air. And we hereby delegate to the EPA, the executive branch agency in charge of administering that law, the power to define what air pollution means, what are acceptable limits on particular air pollutants, then to prescribe penalties for those who exceed those limits, and the power to enforce those same penalties, all vested in one executive branch agency. That might be good for politicians because it allows them to say, I like clean air. But if the EPA then charged with that does things that in some circumstances make no sense, like, for example, when they set the minimum ozone levels at a level below where Mother Nature herself has set them, as has happened in some parts of the country, people become outraged, they complain to Congress, members of Congress beat their chests and say, those barbarians at EPA, I'm gonna write them a strongly worded letter, as if that were our job as lawmakers to write a strongly worded letter. But in reality, all we've done is pass the buck to the EPA. We've done the same thing with EPA, as we have with occupational safety and health requirements with OSHA, MSHA, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, alphabet soup agency after alphabet soup agency throughout the federal government has lawmaking power. That's inappropriate.
Sorry. I should remind everybody that there's a bit of a lag in this conversation because of the technology, so we might interrupt each other and appear rude, but the lag has something to do with that. And maybe me being rude also has something to do with it. But there's all this talk about the deep state. And I'm just thinking that some of that could well be generated as a consequence of what you're describing. You know, as more and more decisions are delegated or relegated, more accurately, to entities that aren't accountable in the same way, then it would seem logical that an extra governmental government, so to speak, emerges. I mean, the same thing happens in a country like Canada, where the civil service becomes more and more powerful across time because responsibility is relegated to it by legislators that aren't willing or can't maintain their responsibility. Or it's passed on to the court to make decisions, to make law de facto, because the legislators won't take the initiative to do so. They can put it off. So what kind of reception does this kind of argument get among your peers and among your political opponents?
It's interesting, Dr. Peterson. Most of my colleagues in the Senate and our counterparts in the House would, I suppose, if they were part of this conversation today, say that they don't necessarily disagree with the fact that we've moved power from states and localities to Washington, and then within Washington, we've given power away from the people's elected lawmakers who have voluntarily delegated that power over to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, and in many cases, the President of the United States. Many of them, perhaps most of them, would agree that to a degree that has happened. What they would say next would depend in part on their political persuasion. Some of them would say, yeah, that's true, but it doesn't matter because this is a good thing. And we really benefit from the specialized expertise of those who occupy these executive branch agencies. And I want to make very clear, I've got nothing but respect for those individuals. They're by and large, well-educated, hardworking, well-intentioned people with a high degree of specialization. My point is not that we can't learn from them. My point is that they're not lawmakers. They don't stand accountable to the people in regular elections or elections ever.
Yeah, well, you said, for example, you said that the EPA that had many positive effects. You seem also still worried about it, and so I might object. Well, if it's had those positive effects, then what's the problem? Why worry about it? And so I would like to know that. Why is that a problem?
Because our government needs to be ours. And that means that the laws, a law consists of a set of words that prescribe a rule of general applicability, imposing affirmative obligations on members of the public. When a law, thus understood, is prescribed in our system of government by the federal government at the federal level, you have to follow a formula for it to be legitimate. And that's true for not just the philosophical constitutional reason, but also for the practical reason that you don't want the lawmaking power, which is the most dangerous of the powers of government, to be ever in the hands of people you can't fire. They work for you. And if you can't fire the people who make these laws, as well-educated and well-intentioned as they might be, you got a problem.
Mm-hmm. So you see something like a drift over time, so that the legislative power drifts out of the bodies that are supposed to be exercising it into other specialized areas, and that has the risk of escaping public accountability. So I guess what you might argue then is that the EPA and legislation like it produces some short, medium-term positive outcomes, but it has this long-term potential payment lurking in the background, and we always have to keep an eye on that. So, but I mean, what do you do about that in this situation, though? Because the power has been ceded to the federal government, and it looks like the legislators can't keep up. So what's the solution? Or what are the steps towards a solution?
The easiest way that I can answer that question, because it took us 80 plus years to get here, 82, 83 years from the date I identified to get here. The solution to that is going to take some time.